Hey, welcome to Spectral Echoes, a collection of Reddit stories as told by people high as a kite. But it's Reddit, who knows, right? If you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so you don't miss out on these awesome horror stories. Now, let's get started.
Doors best left unopened.
The red door in the abandoned sanatorium.
I had no intention of recounting this story, but some experiences simply won't let you stay silent. It began when we, a group of architecture students, went to survey an abandoned sanatorium on the outskirts of Strasbourg. The afternoon weather was gloomy and still. Our first task was to set up camp in front of the main hall and then venture deep into the building to document the state of its crumbling walls, long, echoing corridors, and peeling plaster ceilings. Everything was covered in so much dust and mold that you felt as if time itself had forgotten the place since 1975, when the nursing home ceased operations due to a lack of funding. We moved from the ground floor to the second, and then entered the entire length of the final corridor, nearly 100 meters long and shrouded in darkness. Light only pierced through broken windows intermittently. And just as I stepped into a secluded corner of that corridor, I saw it. A strikingly new red door, completely devoid of dust or cobwebs, a stark contrast to the surrounding decay of a long-abandoned place. I froze, startled, then tried to push it gently, but the door wouldn't budge. Something invisible seemed to block it. There was no rigid lock, yet it wouldn't open, despite my multiple attempts with sweaty hands. The light emanating from that door seemed to draw my gaze in the gloomy space. The entire group fell silent, and everyone quickly moved past as if unwilling to acknowledge the strange door. Someone quietly muttered not to respond to that corridor, but no one replied. I distinctly remember taking only one photograph of that spot. Then we bypassed it for the rest of that afternoon's survey. A mix of apprehension and curiosity, typical of someone who dares not look back yet still yearns to. That evening, we slept in tents outside the sanatorium's gate. The wind whistling through the iron gate in the dark sent chills down our spines, and I couldn't sleep a wink, the image of that glowing red door constantly in my mind. I eventually drifted off and dreamed I was standing before it once more. No one else around in the desolate room. But from inside the door came a tapping sound. Tap, tap. Steady and persistent, as if asking if anyone was there. I jolted awake, my blanket drenched in sweat. Looking down at my feet, I discovered my shoes were soaked with mud, even though the weather was dry with no rain, and I was certain I had taken them off and placed them outside the tent. The next morning, no one mentioned the previous night's events, but I noticed their eyes looking at me with suspicion. Then a friend casually asked if there were muddy footprints in front of the red door. I tremblingly replied that I didn't know, but looking down, we clearly saw large footprints imprinted on the concrete, and beside them, a white piece of paper placed at the base of the wall. I didn't dare pick it up, sensing that someone had deliberately placed it for me to see, waiting for me to retrieve it. But I wasn't brave enough, and we quickly left. During the afternoon survey the next day, when the group returned to the final floor, the spot where the red door had vanished completely. There was only a smooth, blank wall as if no door had ever existed. No frame, no hinges. Everything was stark and empty, leaving the group so unnerved that we abandoned the survey then and there. I looked at the photos I had taken and the video footage captured sweeping across the end of the corridor the day before. The red door clearly existed in the footage, and I also detected a very faint sound, like a gentle tap on the camera lens, as it swept past that point, though it was unclear. I returned to the city, sharing the information, photos, and video in our group chat. Everyone debated that it was just a light anomaly, the reddish shadow of the afternoon sun, or a blurred small window from the floor above. I was speechless, unable to explain it myself, but my mind reeled, clinging to the rationalization that it was all just a hallucination due to lack of sleep, caffeine, or project stress. I began to adjust my sleep schedule, took mild sedatives, and avoided thinking about the old sanatorium. But every night, I still dreamed of that long, moss-covered corridor. Sometimes the red door wasn't there, but I still heard the tapping, tap, tap, growing steadily closer. The door no longer appeared, but the tapping felt invisible and so close that I felt I was standing before something. I woke up, my heart pounding without explanation. I consulted a doctor for insomnia and anxiety. They diagnosed stress and prescribed medication, asking if I heard voices. I said no, only a recurring sound whose origin I couldn't identify. The doctor shrugged, suggesting it might be lucid dreaming or a scattered mind. They couldn't help me with something outside the realm of their scientific knowledge. In the following months, I moved house, drank less coffee, avoided going out late at night, and tried not to think about the red door. But the dreams still returned. I dreamed of the abandoned, power-cut corridor, light footsteps echoing faintly, and the flickering glow of candles and a red door appearing. Some nights I felt myself whispering, "Tap," in response, only to freeze when I realized I had replied but couldn't form the sound distinctly in my dream. One day, while lecturing about abandoned architecture to my class, my hands trembled as I spoke the name of the old sanatorium. A student asked why the landscape was so haunting. I didn't dare tell the full story, merely thinking to myself that some dark corners should remain unspoken, yet can never be forgotten. Now, whenever the clock strikes 11:47 p.m., I feel a distinct unease, as if someone is waking me. Not through my phone, not by blocking networks, but by a sheer moment of silence that allows me to clearly hear my heartbeat. And it's as if between me and that darkness, there is an unspoken, patient connection waiting for a response. I'm not sure if I'm still entirely sane whenever I recall the unusual appearance of that red door, the tapping sound. It lingers in my memory but never truly disappears. I still maintain the habit of not walking through dark corridors after 10 p.m. Still feel as if someone is standing and waiting for me to answer that door again. Even though I dare not seek it out for fear that once more, I will have to hear that tap, tap, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer again.
The room at the end of the hospital corridor.
Sometimes in life, we encounter places that refuse to be forgotten. Not because there's anything particularly special about them, but because they simply don't allow us to forget. I used to believe that memories would fade with time, that the events that transpired during my third-year medical internship at a rural Scottish hospital would gradually be covered in dust, like old patient files in a cabinet. But no, some things linger, clear and persistent, not in memory, but in a deeper, slower part of me, silently reminding me that I've never truly left that place. The hospital wasn't large, 3 floors, moss-covered brick walls, long narrow corridors. During the day, it was so quiet you could clearly hear the wheels of trolleys rolling across the floor. The inpatient ward on the 3rd floor was where I was assigned for night duty, and despite the perpetually chilly weather and the misty mornings that blanketed the windows, I never felt anything particularly unsettling until I noticed the room at the very end of the corridor, room 308. Its door was always closed, painted a faded white, and unlike the other doors that were cracked or peeling, it was almost perfectly intact. The only thing that bothered me was that it didn't have a proper doorknob, just a dull metal plate loosely attached, as if to signal that no one needed to open it anymore. When I asked an old nurse about it, she simply waved her hand and said, "It's under repair, not in use," offering no further explanation. No one in the hospital talked much about room 308. No patient names were ever listed there, nor were there any records associated with it. But every night on duty, when I walked past it, I felt the air slow down, as if sound itself was held captive before that door. Once, I saw a sliver of light reflecting from underneath the door, a faint yellow glow from within, very subtle, like the light from an old desk lamp. But when I returned later, the light was gone. I didn't tell anyone, as I wasn't even sure if I had seen it correctly myself. But then, one night, during the 20-somethingth night of my internship, I had to go to the 3rd floor later than usual to complete some patient records a doctor had asked for. As I returned to the nurse's station, I noticed that the door to room 308 was no longer tightly closed as it always was. It was slightly ajar, a small gap just enough to glimpse the darkness within. And this time, I clearly felt something standing inside, not a person or a shape, but a presence. I didn't intend to enter, but as if by an unconscious reflex, I stepped closer, bending down slightly to peer through the crack. There was nothing inside, an empty room, no bed, no table, no medical equipment, just an old wooden chair placed in the middle of the room, facing away from me. A faint, yellowish light emanated from an unknown source, not bright enough to clearly see the ceiling or floor, but enough to hold my gaze. And then I heard a sound, faint, like someone whispering very close to my ear in an indistinct language, not quite words but a fleeting murmur, sending goosebumps up my neck and a cold shiver down my spine for a long, motionless moment. I retreated, faster than I expected, almost running back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding, not daring to look back. That night, I couldn't sleep, and when I finally dozed off, I dreamed. In the dream, I stood again before the door of room 308, but this time I held an old, rusty iron key. I inserted the key into the lock and opened the door. It made no sound. And as I stepped inside, the room was as empty as in reality, but I sat on the wooden chair in the middle. Facing me was a person, or a shadow of a person, but I couldn't see their face. That person spoke, their voice very faint, almost inaudible. "You opened the door. Now you must remember the way out." I woke up precisely at 3:08 a.m. This repeated for the next 5 nights. Every night, the same dream, the same room, the same words, the same time. I started jotting notes in my notebook, trying to find a pattern, trying to explain everything through medicine, through work pressure, through sleep mechanisms. But no theory made me feel any better. On the 6th night, I decided to tell the head physician, a calm, taciturn man, but with very unique eyes, the kind of person who had witnessed so much that nothing surprised him anymore. When I finished my story, he sat silently for a long time, then slowly said, "Room 308 has been sealed since 1992. There's no key. That door is a dead door." I waited for him to say more, but he stood up and left the room, leaving me with a host of unanswered questions. I requested an early end to my internship a few days later. Friends and colleagues thought I was stressed, overwhelmed, or dealing with personal issues. I didn't correct them, nor did I try to explain. But even after leaving Scotland, I couldn't escape those dreams. The room returned, repeating itself in my sleep, sometimes just the hospital corridor with its damp yellow light, sometimes the image of the chair in the middle of the room, sometimes I was standing outside the door, holding the key but unable to open it. And sometimes, I was already inside, not remembering how I entered, nor knowing how to find my way out. Only once, I dreamed I was sitting opposite that person in the room, and that time I saw their face. It was me, but older, gaunt, with sunken eyes, and a completely expressionless face. He just looked at me. And in that moment, I knew that I wasn't just the one dreaming, but also the one being remembered. I tried to review the photos, notes, and even the secretly recorded video footage I took while surveying the corridor. At precisely the 3-minute mark, there's a pan shot across the end of the 3rd floor corridor, and there, room 308's door is clearly visible, faded paint, and in the background audio of the camera, if you listen very closely, you can hear a faint 3-tap knock, as if someone was patiently waiting for a response. I never watched that segment again. But I kept it, for some unknown reason. Perhaps as proof that I wasn't imagining things. Perhaps because deep down, I still believe that something truly opened on the night I stood before the door to room 308. Not the white painted wooden door, but something larger, deeper, and I had unconsciously allowed it to step into my mind. To this day, I still dream. And in recent dreams, the room is no longer empty. There are scratches on the walls, like fingernail marks. The chair is still there, but sometimes, the door doesn't open anymore. It closes behind me. And the person opposite is no longer silent. I don't clearly remember what that person says, only that when I wake up, I always sit bolt upright in the middle of the night, my heart pounding like a drum, my hands still clenched as if holding the key from the dream. And the clock, it's always 3:08 a.m.
Room 243 never locks.
Occasionally in life, we stumble upon places that refuse to be forgotten. Not because there's anything particularly special about them, but because they simply won't allow us to forget. I once thought memories would fade with time, that the events of my 3 years studying at a university located on a small road winding through the low hills south of Dublin, a place with year-round damp weather, where winter fogs were so thick the ancient dormitory blocks seemed swallowed by a hazy white curtain, would gradually become covered in dust, like old patient records in a forgotten cabinet. But no, some things remain, clear and persistent, not in my conscious memory, but in a deeper, slower part of me, constantly whispering that I've never truly left that place. Block B was where I resided for 3 years, a place where everything proceeded normally. Life was slow, repetitive, and safe, with the exception of room 243. I vividly recall first hearing about it upon my arrival. A second-year student on the same bus inadvertently pointed to the building and advised me that if I wanted a peaceful stay, I should avoid Block B's second floor, as there was a room there that no one ever rented, yet always had its lights on. At the time, I merely chuckled, dismissing it as a typical student legend, the kind new arrivals were always subjected to, much like the ubiquitous ghost stories found in dorms everywhere. But as I lived there longer and paid closer attention, I began to realize that something truly was out of the ordinary. Room 243's door was always ajar, sometimes slightly open as if waiting for someone to step in, sometimes closed but never locked. There was no nameplate, no sign of occupancy, yet the ceiling light remained on when night fell. And if one were curious enough, as I was one sleepless October night, they would find the room inside impeccably clean and tidy, suggesting its occupant had only just stepped out to buy something and would return momentarily. The bed was neatly made, the sheets flat and unwrinkled, a glass of water still sat on the table, and the air carried a faint scent of freshly wiped damp wood, not the smell of long-accumulated dust, but of life, of a recent presence. I only stood there for a few minutes, not venturing further in, not touching anything. I took out my phone and snapped a photo to tease my roommate, saying that someone had finally moved into room 243. But when I opened the picture, the screen was completely white. No error, no blur, no darkness, just a pure blank white, as if no image had ever existed. I tried taking it a few more times, and each time it showed a silent white, like a void that couldn't retain anything. From that day on, every time I walked past that room, I felt as if an unseen gaze was emanating from within. Not clear, not tangible, a very specific sensation, as if someone stood behind a curtain or a slightly ajar door, merely watching, doing nothing else. I tried checking multiple times, day and night, when many people were passing by or when the block was most deserted. The room's door was always unlocked, always carefully ajar, as if an invisible hand had gently pulled it just enough to create a space that neither invited nor refused. One day, I tried placing my phone in front of the room and set it to record. I left it for about 20 minutes, then returned. When I listened back, the beginning only captured the faint sound of wind whistling through the narrow corridor, occasionally distant footsteps of students, or the sound of other doors opening and closing. But then, as I fast-forwarded to the middle of the recording, I heard a sound like a whisper, indistinct words, as if multiple people were talking in a closed room, their voices blending together, almost impossible to discern the content, yet enough to make the listener distinctly feel that they were not alone in that space. I listened to that audio segment over and over, trying to isolate the words, attempting to filter the sound with simple software, but I couldn't clarify anything further. The sound seemed to dissolve into the air after each playback. I didn't tell my roommate about this, fearing they'd think I was delusional or exaggerating, but I myself started to feel uneasy walking down that corridor, to the point where sometimes I would take a different route just to avoid passing by room 243's door, not because I was afraid someone would jump out, but because I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched, the feeling that I shouldn't have known about the existence of that place. And once I did, the room's silence would begin to respond. I proactively contacted the dormitory management to request a change of blocks, citing a simple desire to move closer to the library. And fortunately, a few weeks later, I was transferred to Block A. From then on, I no longer had to walk past that room, but the memory of it did not fade. On some nights, I dreamed of wandering into an empty corridor, where all doors were locked except for one that was slightly ajar, and in my dream, I knew for certain it was room 243, Only the number wasn't visible, just a blank space on a plaque, but I still recognized it. And as I approached the door, all sound seemed to be sucked away, to the point where I couldn't even hear my own breathing. A year later, I returned to the old dormitory block with some international friends who were visiting, just strolling around and recounting old stories. As we passed Block B, I tried to approach the old spot to see if the room was still open. That's when I discovered the nameplate had changed. The room was no longer numbered 243, but 241B, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase its traces. But the door was still the same, ajar, unlocked, no occupant's nameplate, unchanged. I didn't touch it again. I just stood and looked for a moment, then turned away. But in the instant I took one last glance, I clearly saw the door move very slightly, as if someone very close behind it had inadvertently or intentionally shifted their hand away from the inside of the door. I never returned to that area again. No one at the university ever spoke of room 243. No one officially mentioned it as a taboo, but no one seemed surprised if someone brought it up either. It was as if that place existed on the boundary between what is known and what cannot be defined, between an empty room and something that once existed, but no one wanted to retain. Sometimes I wonder if I hadn't had that sleepless night, if I hadn't stepped into that room for the first time, would I ever have been drawn into this strange sensation? But then I realized, perhaps the very fact that the room was always open was what was waiting for someone to approach, not because it needed an occupant, but because it wanted someone to acknowledge that it still existed, even if it no longer belonged to any administrative map or room diagram. And every autumn, when the cold winds begin to sweep in, when darkness envelopes that old stone corridor, I still have the habit of turning on my phone, playing the old recording, and listening to that sound from years ago. Not because I want to learn anything more, but just to remind myself that there are some doors that don't need to be locked, because they were never truly opened by hand.
The small door behind the library cabinet.
There are places that people pass by every day, see 100 times, and touch 1,000 times, but only in one very specific moment. When the light hits just the right angle, when the mind is quieter than usual, or when something is slightly askew from the daily rhythm, do they notice something that has always been present but was never paid attention to? And sometimes, that thing should not have been seen at all. I once worked a winter season at an old library on the outskirts of Leeds, a place with Victorian architecture, curved arches, dark bricks, and a cold, seemingly endless corridor. Every sound was muffled by the thick wooden floors and walls, making footsteps echo from a deep place below. It was also a place where, amidst thousands of dusty books and forgotten records, I found something for which there is still no satisfactory explanation. I was only a second-year student then, working part-time at the library to earn a little extra money. My job was mostly sorting books, processing loans, and occasionally being assigned to clean the archives on the ground floor. This was the least frequented area because most old records from the 1970s onwards were stored there in heavy cabinets with faded brown paint, rusty locks, and labels so smudged that even the manager sometimes didn't remember what was inside. It was a December afternoon. It was already getting dark outside even though it was just past 4 o'clock. I was tasked with reorganizing the file cabinets by year, a tedious job that lasted for hours, causing me to work almost by habit rather than paying attention to my surroundings. That is until I pulled one of the cabinets away from the wall to clean the dust behind it. That's when I discovered what I believe was the first detail that led to the series of haunting events that followed. A small wooden door, low and narrow, only about 1.5 meters high, and as wide as a crawl space under a staircase. It was hidden behind the cabinet, had no handle, but had hinges and a thin gap running between the wooden edge and the wall. I stood there for a moment, wondering why I had never seen it before despite having cleaned this archive many times. I then tried to push it gently, and the door immediately opened, making a very faint creaking sound as if it had been used recently. This made me pause for a few seconds before stepping inside almost instinctively. Inside was a very narrow, low hallway, just tall enough to crouch through. It was less than 10 meters long, paved with worn gray tiles, and ended in a small, square room with no lights, no windows, and nothing but 4 rough stone walls and a series of black and white photographs hung crookedly on the wall opposite the entrance. I turned on my phone's flashlight, approached, and saw that the photos were all of library staff. At least, that was my guess, as they were all wearing old formal attire, waistcoats and long skirts. Some photos had dates like 1962, 1958, A few were too blurry to make out faces. Then I stopped at one in the bottom row, where a group of people stood in a line in front of the library entrance. It looked very much like the current main hall, and the person standing at the very end of the line, when I looked closely, had a face that was mine. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was me, from the hairline, the shape of the nose, the look in the eyes, and even the surprised expression as if caught off guard by the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. My mind scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe it was a doppelganger, maybe the light created a deceptive reflection, or perhaps my mind was simply projecting a familiar face onto a vague one out of fear. But the more I looked, the clearer I saw that it was me. Not just similar, but an exact match, as if I had been standing there, in 1962, wearing a wrinkled vest, next to a group of people who had long since passed away. I left the room immediately, without taking a photo or touching anything. I pushed the cabinet back into its place and told no one what I had seen. Partly out of fear of being dismissed as delusional, partly because I didn't know where to begin, and most importantly, because I myself wasn't sure what was real and what was my imagination. In the following days, I still went to work, sorted books, and cleaned the archive, but I stayed away from that area, telling myself that I must have been too tired and was hallucinating, or that someone had printed a fake photo to scare new students. The matter seemed to end there until a few weeks later, after my part-time contract had finished. I returned to the library to get my internship confirmation, only to find the archive area securely locked, the door blocked by a crossbar with a temporary seal. When I asked about it, a new staff member said that the walls in that area were being inspected for minor structural cracks. I tried to act normally and casually asked if there had ever been a small door behind the file cabinets, but the manager looked at me with a confused expression and said with certainty that there had not. The archive was built in 1984, the walls were solid, with no doors leading off, and they themselves didn't have any keys for it besides the main entrance. I didn't know how to react. I still vividly remember that afternoon, the small square room, the gray-tiled hallway, and the faded black and white photos, and I remembered my own face in the photo dated 1962. But I couldn't prove anything. I had no photos, no one was with me, no evidence that the passage had ever existed, as if it were all just a part of a long dream, lasting just long enough to deceive me, and then vanishing when it was no longer needed. I've carried that question with me for years, still dreaming of that room, still imagining the narrow hallway whenever I'm in a place with dim yellow light and the smell of old paper. And sometimes in my dreams, I find myself standing before the photographs, but no longer at the end of the line. I'm in the middle, as if time has gradually pushed me to the center, and all the other people in the photo have faded, leaving only me, the clearest, most present figure, looking straight into the lens like the only sane person in a crowd long forgotten. I still don't know if I actually stepped into that room in reality or if it was just a fabricated memory created by an exhausted mind during winter. But what always haunts me is that if I was never there, why was I in a photograph from 1962? And if I was there and don't remember, then is what I'm living now the second time I'm experiencing things that have already happened?
The attic door.
One thing I learned during my internship at the university library is that the less frequented places are the ones most likely to leave an indelible mark on your mind. Not quite memories, but rather a persistent feeling, a subtle, dust-like sensation that never quite dissipates. The library itself was located on the northern side of the campus, an old 19th century building with distinctive pointed roofs and a high veranda, whose afternoon shadows always made everything feel as if it were submerged in water. I was assigned to the document technical department, where my work was simple yet somewhat monotonous, checking, organizing, and cataloging old book archives, most of which were located on the ground or first floor. But during a brief conversation early in the week with a manager, Mr. Harris, a tall, thin man with salt and pepper hair, a consistently monotone voice, and eyes that often seemed to evade contact, I was casually reminded of a detail that seemed utterly unrelated: the attic. At the time, he made it very clear, the attic was a deep storage area, strictly off-limits to everyone. Only the head of the department had the key, and the area had been mostly sealed off for years due to structural weakness. I didn't pay it much mind or question it, as that floor had never been part of my daily duties. Moreover, the staircase leading up to it was hidden behind the meeting rooms, always closed and covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had ever passed through. Everything would probably have remained uneventful if it hadn't been for a peculiar rain spell in early November. Not a heavy downpour, but a persistent drizzle that lasted for 3 days, leaving the entire library perpetually damp. The ceiling lights flickered constantly, and specifically, that afternoon, while I was working alone in the second-floor archive, I distinctly heard footsteps from directly above. The footsteps weren't heavy or hurried, but steady and slow, as if someone was moving very carefully to avoid making noise. However, because the old wooden floor creaked with every step, the sound became even more prominent in the library's already suffocatingly quiet atmosphere. Initially, I thought it was a mouse or a cat, as there used to be a cat that roamed discreetly among the bookshelves here, but the steps were too distinct, too rhythmic. And what chilled me the most was that when I moved closer to the attic staircase to listen, the sound stopped, as if the other person was also listening to me. I felt a slight panic, considering the possibility of an intruder having climbed in through the roof, so I immediately went to find Mr. Harris to report it. He arrived very quickly, without much questioning, simply taking a large bunch of keys from his desk drawer and gesturing for me to follow. When we reached the location, he paused for a few seconds before the old wooden door, then inserted the key into the lock, his movements slightly slow, as if contemplating something in his mind. As the door opened, the smell of damp mold rushed out like a cold mist. The light from the corridor couldn't reach far, and I saw a small, spiral wooden staircase leading upwards, with rusty railings. Each step produced a strange resonance, not quite a creak, but more like the sound of joints that hadn't moved in a long time. When we reached the attic floor, everything was pitch black. Although Mr. Harris turned on the light, only a few bulbs illuminated. The rest flickered as if about to fail, creating an unstable, patchy light, like fractured mirrors shimmering on the floor. At the end of the corridor, I saw an old wooden door slightly ajar, not fully open, just enough to see a faint light from within. My initial feeling upon seeing it wasn't fear, but a sense of suspicion, a suspicion that someone had just left there not long ago. We approached. The door had no lock, no sign, just a plain door, slightly tilted as if its hinges were askew. When it opened, I saw an archive room inside, or what used to be one, as there were many cardboard boxes, tilted wooden shelves, and in the middle of the room, a long dust-covered table. But what made me stop, not taking another step, was that on the table lay a pen and a thin piece of paper, yellowed, dotted with rainwater, but the handwriting was still visible. It was a dark, smudged script, like dried blood, with chaotic strokes that made me squint several times before I could dimly decipher the phrase "cannot escape" or perhaps "no way out." I wasn't sure, as the last word seemed to be smeared by something very damp and black. I had never felt such a chill down my spine. Not the kind of fear from encountering ghosts or demons, but a profound unease, similar to the feeling when witnessing something the brain cannot process, leaving the whole body motionless, waiting for an unnamed signal of danger. Mr. Harris also remained silent, looked around once, then gestured for us to turn back. We didn't discuss it further, just closed the door, locked it from the inside with a wooden latch, and descended in silence. I didn't dare ask, and he didn't explain. From that day on, everything seemed to become unstable. In the evenings, even though the attic's electrical circuit breaker was off, the security guard occasionally reported seeing lights faintly flickering, as if someone was trying to turn on a flashlight or a reading lamp. Each time, Mr. Harris simply noted it in his logbook, saying nothing. I meanwhile began to hear small sounds, sometimes the rustling of paper, sometimes soft footsteps, and once I'm certain I heard the wooden door being gently pushed, very gently. But no one believed me, as those sounds never appeared on the camera footage. About a month later, the library began moving its main archives to a new building. I was no longer assigned to the attic floor, and no one brought up that day's events again, but I always felt that something hadn't concluded. Every time I walked past that corridor, whether during the day or late afternoon, I always felt as if someone was standing on the top floor, watching me through some small gap between the wooden planks, not a hostile gaze, but the gaze of something accustomed to silence, slowly learning how to rejoin the conversation. After my internship ended, I left the university and moved to another city. But I still occasionally wake up with a start in the middle of the night, hearing soft, slow footsteps as if walking right behind me, even though I live in a fourth-floor apartment with no one else. I haven't told anyone that story, partly because I don't know where to begin, and partly because I'm afraid that if I speak of it, it will find me faster.
If you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so you don't miss out on these awesome horror stories.